welcome to this game review. We'll have a look at a game in which we got the rook endgame quite early on, and mostly it will be about the rook endgame, and we'll try to learn some important principles about what to do in such endgames. So it started as the Sicilian. White played the open Sicilian, knight f6, knight c3, and from here black chose e6, which is one of the lines here. This is called the four knights Sicilian, as it can still anything can happen here. If knight d to b5, then black is likely to be forced into a Sveshnikov Sicilian. This is a direct transposition. Otherwise, knight c6 and e5 is the main line here. And after knight e5, knight e4, there's quite a lot of theory here. Black has a lot of choices here, and the game is quite interesting. White played this move bishop g5, which isn't a very good move. This bishop is still needed on the queen side quite often, or it's developed to e3, because white cannot really make use of this pin in any way. After bishop b4, which is a good move, black's bishop is a bit better than this one, as this one is at least threatening to double the pawns. Here white played knight c6, bc, and e5, but e5 is a mistake, and black correctly uses this mistake with queen a5, and this is now a fork. One threat is to take on c3, the other threat is to take on e5, which would be devastating for white, and importantly, if white takes the knight, which he does, the bishop on g5 is even hanging. Here, after taking the pawn on g7, we arrive at this position, which is clearly a lot better for black, because he has the bishop pair. Especially he has the unopposed dark squared bishop, and he also has the huge center with d5 and potentially e5, and white has no central pawns. Also this king is in the center, and it's hard to develop the bishop. So here queen d3 was played, black played a5, and this is a bit unprincipled. Of course he is trying to play bishop a6, but this will just exchange his bishop pair. So this is not really much of an achievement. Instead, opening principles tell us to play in the center, and here d5 is the most obvious and most natural move. For example, if white castles, we can castle kingside. There's no real attack for white, and next we're either playing c5, c4, or e5 and e4. This bishop might go to e6. a5, a4 is also sometimes an idea, but usually we don't want to start with flank pawns. There are much more important things in chess. But a5 objectively is fine. White castles, now d5. So these moves are a bit unrelated. Black could have had a tempo up and not played a5. White plays h3, which is kind of a waste of time. This move doesn't really do anything. And after bishop a6, instead of which probably castles or rook b8 is better. Now white can just move the queen, and if black doesn't want to exchange the bishop pair, he will have to go bishop c8. And if he exchanges, then now black's play didn't really make sense. He used 3 moves to exchange a bishop that was sitting on f1, and now he doesn't really have the bishop pair. Black still has some advantage, as he can always go to an endgame, but his advantage is not that big. So white plays queen g3, and black goes to this endgame, this rook endgame after exchanging everything. But it was clearly better to first take the queen, and due to this move, white is forced to take away from the center. And now the same endgame is a lot better, and also probably it's even better to not exchange the bishop for a knight. And even the engine suggests bishop b7 or bishop c8, just to keep the bishop pair. And black is close to winning positionally because he has the huge center pawns. And this pawn going to g3 means this one is already a passed pawn. Black can also push these pawns if he wants. The king can go to the e7 square. Both rooks have nice open files, and black is basically winning due to all of these factors. Instead, black got a similar endgame, but clearly the pawn being on g3 would be in black's favor. So now black exchanges, and we arrive at a double rook endgame. And the rook endgames, as well as 4 rook endgames, the main principle by far is rook activation. The most important thing is to activate our rooks. This is what black doesn't do. He first pushes a4, which doesn't really achieve much, Sure, if we play a3, rook b8, rook b2, we might pick up the pawn on a2, but this takes a lot of time. Instead, we have some obvious moves like king e7, connecting the rooks and improving the king, or rook g8, attacking the g2 pawn and putting the rook on an open file. Maybe the most accurate is h5, with the idea to play h4 and then rook g8, fixing the pawn on g2. Otherwise, rook b8 is also an obvious move. Either way, we want to play with the rooks firstly. With a4, white correctly activates his rooks on d4, and after a3 and, for example, king d2, white can play c4 to undouble his pawns. This pawn on a3 didn't really achieve much, and white is actually a little bit better as his rooks are even more active compared to these ones. So rook b4 was played, rook g8, now black activates his rooks, g4. Now black plays this move f6, which simply weakens the 7th rank and again doesn't really achieve anything. Black already has to play king e7 to not get cut off on the 7th rank. The king can go to f6, the rooks can go to b8, maybe c5 at some point, and black is a little bit better, but not much. After f6, if white had played rook b7, now white would be clearly the one that's better, because black's rooks are terrible, his king is cut off on the 7th rank, and h7 is hanging. So white is the first one to create threats. If this one joins the game as well, white might win quite soon. So rook b6 happened instead, now the king can defend this pawn. Black sacrificed the pawn on h7, which white doesn't take. h6 is played, but this is a bit slow. Again, the most important thing in rook endgames is to activate the rooks, and black shouldn't really care about this lonely pawn on h7. Sure, if white takes it, he will have an h passer, but it's very far away from doing anything. For example, rook b8, exchanging this rook to play rook b2 would give black some advantage. White shouldn't really take this, because after rook b2, the rooks might infiltrate on the 2nd rank, and this pawn might become very strong. So h6 was played, some exchanges happened, rook e1, rook g8, and now finally black activates his rook, but at the same time white's rook is a little bit more active. So king d2 and rook h8, and again the most important thing is to activate the rook. I understand the idea is h5, but we should be a bit faster with this. For example, f5, with the idea if white takes, we can activate the rook on the f file, and on f5 it will be quite active. The most primitive way to play is probably rook e4, with the idea to play either this or this, attacking some pawns, sometimes h5 as well to exchange some pawns. Okay, rook h8, rook a7, h5, so black eventually gets some activity, but he has lost a pawn. But since his rook is active, he has enough compensation. White has 2 passed pawns on the h and a file, so of course pawn endgames would be horrible, but these rook pawns in rook endgames aren't usually very strong. So rook f5, rook e2, black moves around with his rook, actively placing it. Now white gives up his h-pawn, so the position is now quite drawn. Black might think about some advantage because he has less pawn islands, which makes white's pawns a bit weaker. So a few more moves happen, and here the problem is white is able to put his rook behind the passed pawn, which means this rook will probably have to be passive, or this king. Usually we want our king to stop passed pawns if possible, so instead of allowing our rook to become passive, we should probably block the pawn with the king. Instead what happens is black goes passive. Well, king c5 first is fine, and here king b4, rook a2. At this point we have a choice. Either we block the pawn on a7 or a8. As a rule, we should block the pawn as soon as possible, which means on a7. So rook e7 should have been played, after a6, rook a7, and this pawn is likely to be picked up, and the black will probably have a pawn advantage. White should compensate with activity, but at this point black is taking over. But rook e8 happens, and now the pawn should have been blockaded as soon as possible, but instead c5 and a7 is allowed, and now this rook can never move. So now the position is drawn because white's king cannot activate. Black should probably just pick up the pawn on a7. Instead king c3 happens, but now black cannot really advance his pawns, though he tries. And here after d4 and taking, after c3, now white is winning because he will pick up the pawn on c3 after this check and king d3. And this position is hopeless for black because he can never pick up the a7 pawn because the pawn endgame will be winning for white, and he cannot simply use the rook at all in this game. As soon as it moves, a8 happens. So c3 was a terrible blunder. Instead, black can just go pick up this pawn on f4, go pick up the pawn on a7, and the position should be drawn. For example, after this, king c3, king e5, black is in time to just go and pick up the pawn. He can't really play for an advantage. But instead, after c3, here black even managed to win this position somehow. Here after rook b1, king c5, white should just defend his pawn from the side. This pawn is going to drop, and white is winning. But after this, and rook a7, the position is again drawn. Though a few moves later, black picks up the pawn on f4 somehow. Let's see how. Yeah, rook f3. And again, the position is a draw, but with the f pawn or the c pawn, it is now a little bit more difficult. So let's see how white should have made the draw. So first, black was allowed to push the king back a little bit, and after f4, this is the moment where white could make a draw, and this is the typical Chessodoro position after rook a8. The point is now that this pawn has gone to f4, black will not be able to hide from the checks. For example, if check, we have to go to f1 or g1, and importantly now, after king g3, we shouldn't give a check, though a check is still possible. The most obvious way to draw here would be to play rook f8. If king f3, threatening checkmate, then king g1. This is a known drawn position after check, and here the white king is on the short side and the rook will check from the side. For example, the typical move here would be this, threatening king e2. After rook a8, white will have enough counterplay. So this is quite a known position. This should be studied a bit more. This is a theoretical position, and it is a little bit dangerous with the f or c pawns, but with other pawns it is a little bit easier. Instead, white plays rook a4. Now black is winning after this check. King g1, though other moves lose as well. Now king g3. And unfortunately now there is no time to go behind the pawn because this is checkmate. And after white checks, here importantly white cannot defend passively because black has a known motive to win. If the pawn was on the g file, this wouldn't work, but now black can give this check with the point that after this he wins the rook. Otherwise, after this, rook h2 again threatens checkmate, and here black wins again. So this is why white cannot defend on the first rank, and he should be in time to give checks, but after rook a4 he wasn't in time. And from here black managed to win quite convincingly. He promoted to a queen, and the rest of the game is not very interesting. So here black should have probably activated his rook quite a bit earlier. He could have gotten in quite a bit of trouble had white played more actively with rook b7. At this point, even though the endgame started as better for black, now it is better for white.